It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, of course, from the flight deck, and that means more smart talk radio as in your future, and this segment no exception. A fascinating look back at history here. A brand new work called The Castaways' War, One Man's Battle Against Imperial Japan. It has been penned by Stephen Harding. He's a New York Times best-selling author of 9 previous works, including most recently The Last Battle and The Last to Die. He's a journalist that specializes in military affairs. He's currently editor-in-chief of Military History Magazine, lives in Northern Virginia, but has roots in this area. So it should be an interesting conversation indeed. Steve, how are you, my friend?
I am well, Warner, and thanks for having me.
Well, we're pleased to have you here. Interesting, we kind of go through runs where we don't talk about subjects, and then we do, and we've had several segments recently about World War II, and this is, you fit right in. Let's do this. Give us a little bit more background about you, about why becoming an author was so important, and why in particular this story about World War II. What led you to this story?
Well, I think, Warner, like a lot of people my age, I'm a baby boomer. My father and all of my uncles served in World War II, and in fact, they were all in the Pacific. I grew up hearing stories. My father fought in the Aleutians. I had uncles in the Solomon Islands. So I sort of grew up, like a lot of my peers, with the history of World War II in the background. I served in the Army from 1971 to 1974. I started out as an infantryman, but I was fairly badly injured at one point, so I ended up as an Army journalist. When I got out of the Army, I went back to school, got a couple of degrees in history, and I've spent my life since then as both a journalist and an author. And I think, World War II continues to fascinate people just because it was such a monumental worldwide struggle. And also, I think, Warner, I think you would agree that there were clear good and clear evil, which is not always the case in international politics.
When you do this research, do you find that the agencies that you work with, are they cooperative, or do you have to do some sort of serious digging and sort of wiring around from time to time?
Well, because the books that I write tend to be international in the sense that, for example, the Castaways' War deals with both the U.S. military and the Japanese military, there is a lot of research involved. I am not, of course, fluent in Japanese, so I use Japanese researchers. The problem with researching the Japanese side of World War II specifically is that a lot of the records were destroyed either in the bombing of Japan or by the Japanese themselves right after the war. So that can be a little bit difficult. But this is actually a golden age for World War II historians, Warner, because stuff that you at one time had to go to the National Archives, for example, to find unit records and things like that. A lot of that is now online and is much more easily accessible for historians and writers. And that's both for the Pacific and the European theaters. So it can still be a little bit difficult, especially if you're researching, for example, the history of special operations in World War II, the OSS and things like that. That can still be a little difficult because some of those records are still classified and will be for some time. But in my vein, I deal with a lot of official records that are really fairly straightforward if you know where to look for them.
Well, let's dive right in here. Let's talk about Navy Lieutenant Hugh Barr Miller from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And this is his story, although it's a broader story than that. But share with us a little bit about him. This story is about his particular adventure and what he went through, but give us a little setup here.
Well, Hugh Miller, as you mentioned, was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, into what you might call a sort of a Southern aristocracy family. His forebears were fairly important people in that part of the world, and he grew up in a certain amount of wealth. His family owned a plantation outside Hazelhurst, Mississippi. So during the summers, Hugh spent time on a plantation, and there was a family retainer named James Michael, who everybody called Uncle Jim, and he every summer would take Hugh and his brother Robert out and teach them about the outdoors. He taught them to hunt and to fish and to camp, to track, how to move quietly through the woods, things that years later you would find very, very important. But as he grew up, Hugh was an athlete. He played football at the University of Alabama on the Crimson Tide under a very famous coach named Wallace Wade. And, in fact, Hugh was on the team that played in the Rose Bowl on January 1st, 1931, when Alabama beat Washington State by, I think it was something like 24-0. So it must have been a very interesting game. And then Hugh went to law school, and he graduated in 1933 and became an attorney in Mississippi. And that's the setup for him before World War II.
I'm curious, as you wrote this story, did you become more and more intrigued? Was this a story of survival? Is it a story of war? Is it a story of, tell us a little bit, or maybe it's a little bit of all of it.
I think that's exactly right, Warner. It's a story that involves a whole stream of things coming together in one sort of one man's story in World War II. I often describe it as sort of Robinson Crusoe meets the sands of Iwo Jima. It is a survival story in the sense that when Hugh Miller's destroyer is sunk in the Solomons, he's horrifically wounded. But he washes ashore on an island that unfortunately is occupied by the Japanese, and he has to call upon all of those skills that he learned during the summers on the plantation back in Mississippi. It took incredible self-reliance, courage, and just a will to survive that I think most of us would find difficult to summon under the same circumstances. Because in Hugh's case, instead of sort of giving in and being captured by the Japanese, and I think we all know what happened to a lot of people who were captured by the Japanese, he not only avoided capture, he was able to take the war to the Japanese because he was a serving naval officer, and he saw it as his duty to fight the war, and it didn't matter to him whether he was on a destroyer or on a Japanese-held island.
When you hear stories about this, you think, what were they drawing from? What kind of strength were they drawing from? What kind of will were they drawing from? I'm very, very curious. In your opinion, how did Hugh Miller's upbringing affect his attitude towards his situation at the time?
Well, I think part of it, Warner, is that, because he spent so much time in the outdoors, he felt comfortable in himself and in his, what might be called survival skills. He knew that he could live actually quite well under conditions that a lot of us would have problems with. Part of it also was having Wallace Wade as a football coach. Wade was famous for a saying that went something like this: "A man who won't be beaten can't be beaten." Wallace Wade taught self-reliance and strength and personal commitment. And also, Hugh had he wasn't what you would call, I think, deeply religious, but he had a very innate spiritual strength. And when he was confronted with being on this island, being terribly injured, and being hunted by the Japanese, he was able to call on a variety of those sources of strength in a way that allowed him to not give in. And there were times when he was close to it. I mean, he wasn't, a robot, and he wasn't Superman, but he did manage to summon an inner strength and a self-reliance that seriously is amazing.
He just joined us. Yours truly, Warner Lewis. Of course, from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, in the middle of a segment with Stephen Harding, a New York Times best-selling author, has penned 9 previous works. We're talking specifically today about the Castaways' War, one man's battle against Imperial Japan, about Hugh Miller, who was shipwrecked and ultimately ended up on an island and eluded amazingly and fought against the Japanese by himself. Steve, let me ask you this one. If Hugh Miller is there with a colleague, with another fellow soldier, would this have been possible, or was it while it made it difficult to fight alone, he could be a little bit more elusive, could he not?
That's probably true. When Hugh actually landed on this island, he was not alone. He was accompanied essentially by 5 other people. Unfortunately, 2 of them died very quickly. The 3 other people with him on the island were young and relatively uninjured sailors. And part of Hugh's way of looking at his situation was he believed he was dying. When I say he was horrifically injured, I'll just say that when the ship sank, he went into the water perfectly healthy, but then the ship's own depth charges started going off. And these, as we know, depth charges are intended to destroy submarines, so they can do horrific damage to human bodies. If you're too close, obviously, you die immediately. But Hugh was terribly injured, and by the time they reached the island, he thought he was dying. He actually believed that he would be dead within hours. So he told these 3 young, fit sailors to leave him and go seek rescue on their own because he didn't want to be a drag to them. Sadly, the 3 men have never been seen since then. They're still listed as MIA from World War II. And Hugh, I think, was startled when he didn't die. And over the following days and weeks, he managed to gain enough strength back so that he could carry on. But to go back to your original question, Warner, I think because he only had to rely on himself and only had to worry about himself, he was probably much more flexible and a lot more mobile than he might have been had he been with other people.
What was the... all right, I'm going to jump ahead here just a little bit. He is ultimately rescued. Is his story immediately, obviously there's no internet, but does it make the news? Is it out there in a very, very big public way, or was this just sort of a quiet rescue, so to speak, and it laid sort of quietly in history, waiting for Steve Harding to come along and put it all together?
Well, it would have been a very quiet story because in the Pacific there were a lot of examples of people who were shipwrecked or spent time in rafts, as we know. Unbroken is an excellent example of that. But in Hugh's case, within literally hours of his being rescued, he just happened to be found by a reporter who was on the island of New Georgia when Hugh was brought back there. And this reporter, who worked for the Associated Press, knew a good story when he saw one. So he sat down, and even as Hugh was being debriefed by military intelligence people, this gentleman was able to get his story. The guy's name was Art Burgess. He was a very well-known war correspondent. So within days, Hugh's story was up worldwide in the English-language press. And from that point on, Hugh became sort of the exemplar of a lot of these stories of men and in a couple of cases women being sort of shipwrecked but surviving and being rescued. So his story really blew up, and the Navy brought him back to the United States once he'd recovered from his injuries. He was ultimately they were going to make a movie about him. That never happened, although John Wayne wanted to play him at one point. Now, bear in mind that Hugh Miller was about 5'5", probably, and weighed 125 pounds when he was rescued, so I'm not sure what kind of fit John Wayne would have been in the movie. But his story remained pretty well known into the 50s. He appeared on the program This Is Your Life, for example, and the guest host that night just happened to be a young actor named Ronald Reagan. But his story was ultimately supplanted by stories from the Korean War, and Hugh finished out his naval career, and his story was less well known after that.
What about, share with our Lewis at Large listeners, Steve, if you would, tell us about, after he is rescued, tell us about the balance of his life, the publicity, the lack of it, what he did professionally, and how did he handle it, and as he looked back on all of this, what was his point of view?
I think to take the last part of that question first, his point of view about what had happened to him was that it wasn't anything all that special. He saw himself as a naval officer who, because of the exigencies of war, ended up on an island, and he did what he was supposed to do. He kept himself alive. He fought the enemy when he could until he was rescued, and then that was sort of it from his point of view. He was a little surprised and I think occasionally irritated that his story got so much publicity because there were so many other people he felt were more deserving of renown than he was. But he did get the Navy Cross, which is the second highest award below the Medal of Honor in the Navy. So that put him up in a rarefied atmosphere. After the war, Hugh had to deal with the legacy of all of his injuries. He'd been very seriously injured, and those injuries bothered him for the rest of his life. He did stay in the Navy, however, and he became a Navy attorney and ultimately retired as a captain. He, I think, was happy that his story had been told at one point. I don't think he would have been pleased had it kept coming up over and over again. And I think he came to grips with his story. But he had other tragedies in his life. His firstborn son was a crewman on a Pan American airliner that crashed, and his oldest son was killed. So for a lot of World War II veterans, I think Hugh dealt with World War II as one point in his life, and then moved on and lived the rest of his life.
Don't want to at all lessen the extraordinary, incredibly difficult experiences these that he went through, but like you mentioned earlier, that there were several stories, not exactly like this, but of individual heroism, individual survival. In particular, where does this one sort of fall in terms of the place of history?
Well, I may be a little prejudiced, Warner, but I think this story of Hugh Miller is near the top in terms of the important stories of individual perseverance in World War II, especially in the Pacific. You have to remember that a lot of Americans and Allied sailors, for that matter, and soldiers, ended up in the ocean and did not survive. And many of those, in fact, the majority of those who made it to land also did not survive because the Japanese, as we all know now, were brutal in their treatment of prisoners of war and civilians that they interned and so on. And I think in Hugh you have really an exemplar of somebody who took the absolute worst situation and through self-reliance and quiet confidence and without beating his own chest, not only lived through it, he managed to gain valuable intelligence that was extremely useful after his rescue. Whereas many of the people who were able to survive did so by essentially, staying away from the Japanese, which was obviously a very intelligent point of view. But Hugh knew that he could take the war to the Japanese and probably get away with it, and he managed to do that. So I think his story really rates a special mention in the history of World War II.
Well, I guess it begs the question, what is in the future for you? What undoubtedly you're looking at new stories, new ideas. You're awfully prolific, and I know you enjoy it. What's next for you?
Well, a couple of things are happening at once. This story, The Castaways War, and one of my earlier books called The Last Battle, they've both been optioned as motion pictures. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing them on the screen myself. I have a book coming out in November called Dawn of Infamy, which is a true story about something that happened on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. It's the story of a small Army-chartered cargo vessel that was sunk by a Japanese submarine halfway between Seattle and Honolulu, and is really the last mystery of Pearl Harbor. And I think anybody who's interested in not just World War II in the Pacific, but especially Pearl Harbor, will find it a fascinating story because there is a huge mystery surrounding, whether this vessel was the first American casualty of Pearl Harbor, and could the sinking of the ship have changed the course of Pearl Harbor and thus of World War II in the Pacific? So that's sort of what I'm focused on now, and I will be in Honolulu in December for the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, talking about this new book and its place in the sort of pantheon of Pearl Harbor history books.
Well, as we look at the Castaways War, then who do you see? Who plays Hugh Miller? You?
No, I'm far too old. Although I have to tell you, my son Ian is an actor on a very popular television show.
Oh, really?
And I would love to see him played. He's about the right age. But again, I think I may be a tad biased about that. This is the kind of story I think any any young male actor would want to play, just because it has so many elements going for it. Think Tom Hanks in Castaway, but then, instead of talking to a deflated volleyball, he's being chased by the Japanese. I mean, it would be a wonderful part, I think, for any actor. And as much as I'd like my son to play it, I'd like to see anybody play it.
Well, again, the work is called The Castaways War, One Man's Battle Against Imperial Japan, by Stephen Harding. He is a New York Times best-selling author. Steve, again, before we get out of here, how can people get a copy of the book and also find out a little bit more about some of the previous work you've done?
Well, all of my books are available in the usual places: Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I also have a Facebook page. If people just Google my name and Stephen Harding Books, both the Facebook page and I have an author's page with my publisher, Da Capo, those will both come up. And anyone who's interested in knowing more about it can contact me through those pages, and I'd be happy to respond.
Okay. Hey, listen, best of luck with the book. Hope to see it on the big screen, and thanks so much for spending time with us. And again, would love to have you back on again with us.
Oh, it'd be my pleasure, Warner, and thanks for having me.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large. You love your dog and you love your yard, but sometimes what your dog leaves behind can make you not love your yard so much. Well, when that happens, it's Call of Duty Pet Waste Removal Service to the rescue. Large or small dogs, big yard or small, call Call of Duty. They clean up the mess your dog leaves behind. So if you're tired of cleaning pet waste from your yard, call Call of Duty, 764-7224. That's 764-7224. Prompt, effective, courteous services on the way. Your yard is left clean and waste-free. So don't waste any more time on waste. Call Call of Duty in Lawrence, 764-7224. That's 764-7224. Or visit their website, callofduty2010.web.com.